Welcome to Chapter 2, Understanding 21st Century Learners. In Chapter 2, we're going to describe the characteristics of the 21st century learner, discuss the learning theories, we're going to list principles of effective instruction, we're going to talk about those principles and the technology and media that can be utilized. We are going to discuss the concept of text literacy and compare and contrast the advantages and limitations of integrating text into learning. So, turning on over to pages 20 and 21, the chapter gets into talking about metacognition and motivation. And metacognition is a term that's used to describe the ability to oversee one's personal learning and to understand how to regulate yourself in the learning process. Motivation, of course, is our desire to see a task completed. It defines what people will do rather than what they can do. And then multiple intelligences was developed by Gardner, and you can read more about that on page 21. Gardner's theory implies that effective teachers need to consider different learning abilities of their students. They need to recognize that students vary widely in the terms of strength and weakness in each of these areas. And 21st century learners come into the classroom with abilities from all over the place. Our responsibility is to demonstrate how to best address that learning and what their needs are, while also attending to their individual approaches to acquiring knowledge and skills. Most lessons can include a variety of technology and media that address a wide range of student abilities. For example, if your lesson can include writing activities for students with verbal or linguistic strengths, the use of graphics for visual or special abilities, or out-of-seat activities for students who prefer that hands-on, touchy-feely learning. The chapter goes on to talk about some physiological factors that affect learning and also learning style measurements. But what I really want to talk about is the learning theories that start on page 23. And the first learning theory or perspective is the behaviorist perspective. And in the 1950s, B.F. Skinner, he was a psychologist at Harvard University, he was a proponent of what he called and labeled behaviorism. And it was a scientific study of observable behavior, basically. He was interested in voluntary behavior, such as skill acquisition, rather than reflexive behavior. He demonstrated that reinforcing or rewarding desired responses would shape the behavior of a pattern of an organism. So he worked with animals some. He based his learning theory, known as reinforcement theory, on a series of experiments with pigeons. He reasoned that the same procedures could be used with humans, and that the result was the foundation for computer-assisted instruction. Unlike earlier learning research, Skinner's work was really logical and precise, and it directly improved instruction and learning in many ways. But just like every perspective, there are limitations, and behaviorists refuse to speculate what goes on internally when learning takes place. They rely solely on what's observable, and so as a result, they're more comfortable explaining relatively simple things, simple learning tasks. And behaviorism is limited in its application in teaching those higher level thinking skills. For example, behaviorists are reluctant to make inferences about how learners process information. And although most would argue that in the 21st century, behavioral concepts are not necessarily applicable to the types of learners that you're encountering in the classroom, you can determine that some of those basic knowledge or skills require a behaviorist approach. The next perspective would be cognitivist, And cognitivism is based on the work of a Swiss psychologist, Piaget, and he explores the mental processes of individuals in responding to their environment. Cognitivists have a broader perception of learning than the behaviorists, and students are less dependent upon the guiding hand of the teacher, and they're more reliant upon their own cognitive strategies. And many would suggest that the cognitive approach is to instruction a good compromise between the benchmarks and standards against which students are tested, and a more metacognitive approach to teaching a 21st century learner. The third theory we're going to talk about is Constructivism, and it's a more modern movement that goes beyond the ideas of cognitivism and behaviorism, but it considers the engagement of students in a more meaningful experience, shifting from a passive transfer of information to active problem solving and discovery. So it's more hands-on and creative, project-based type of activities, where the student is able to create their own interpretation of the information that they're being presented. And then also, it has a goal of not to teach the information, but to create conditions in which it can be understood. So the role of instruction is to provide students with ways to assemble the knowledge rather than to just dispense the facts. Let's turn on over to page 24. And we'll talk a little bit about the last learning theory we're going to discuss, and that is the social psychological perspective. It's another well-established approach. Social psychologists tend to look at how the social organization of the classroom affects the learning. So the group structure of the classroom, whether that's in small groups or whole class environments, or independent study. And what is the authority of that structure, and how much control do the students have over their activities? The 21st century learner enters your classroom with a lot of different skills, and especially from a technology-based social networking environment. And the ideas fostered in that social psychology perspective address the independent collaborative abilities of this type of learner. And teachers need to develop this eclectic attitude toward various thoughts of learner psychology. We're not obligated to just particularly, stick to one of these types of perspectives, but it's really good to create a balanced classroom environment by using parts of one or the other and mixing a blended perspective. When you're considering which learning theory best applies to a particular situation, think about learning as more of a whole and not as just one theory or the other. If you look at the end of page 25 and over to page 26, there's a section on principles of effective instruction. And these are really key, good concepts to look through. I want you to be sure and read this section that talks about assessing prior knowledge, considering individual differences, stating objectives and developing metacognitive skills, providing social interaction, incorporating realistic, real-life scenarios, engaging students in relevant practice, and then offering frequent, timely, and constructive feedback. Those are all really solid principles of effective instruction, and reading that section of the chapter I think would be helpful for you in developing your midterm project, which is going to be creating a lesson plan and presentation. And that covers most of chapter 2 that I wanted to discuss, and next we'll be moving on to the Assure model.